Paul M. Wester Jr. was named as the first Chief Records Officer for the U.S. government in March of 2011. He leads records management throughout the federal government with an emphasis on electronic records. He's responsible for issuing federal records management policy and guidance, liaisoning with the Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as OMB, the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Government CIO Council, and other stakeholders on records management issues, and serves as an ombudsman to ensure that NARA and its agencies, and the agencies it serves, rather, meet their statutory mandates and records management requirements. Paul is second in line here. Bill Mayer, who's over here at the end, was named the Executive for Research Services for NARA in 2012. He has more than 20 years of experience working in dynamic research environments, most recently having served as the University Librarian at American University in Washington, D.C. from 2001 to 2007. He was the Associate University Librarian for Information Technology and Technical Services at George Washington University. So many of you may know him in his former roles. Cecilia Muir, here third from the end, is currently serving as the first Chief Operating Officer at Library and Archives Canada, a position created in 2012. She is responsible for all the Library and Archives Canada operations spanning acquisitions to preservation to access of published and archival material from both government and private sources. She has held senior positions in social policy, program delivery, and operations in a variety of federal departments, before joining LAC in 2010 as Assistant Deputy Minister in the Resource Discovery Sector. Cecilia was Assistant Secretary to Cabinet at the Privy Council Office. And finally, last but not least, Paul Wagner is Director General of Innovation and Chief Information Officer in the Information Technology Branch at the Library and Archives Canada. Prior to this, he served as Director General, Customer Relations and Business Intake. He has served various terms as Chief Information Officer and Chief Technology Officer of Justice Canada and Director General of Service Canada. I should also note that he served 1 year as the Director of the Ottawa Flying Club. So please help me to welcome all four panelists who will speak variously about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open up to a wide question and answer and discussion session following that. So thank you, panelists.
All right, thank you very much, James. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming out and being able to participate in this afternoon's panel session. Before I get into my remarks, I want to acknowledge Tom Blanton and thank him for the kind words about our capstone policy, which I'll talk a little bit about as part of my presentation. I've actually been on panels with Tom before. The last time was with Ed Cohen at the CIA. I think it's fair to say that this will probably be a much more collegial afternoon. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the Managing Government Directive that has been talked a little bit about earlier in the session this afternoon, and talk about the environment that the National Archives has to operate in, which we've also talked a little bit about this afternoon. As the Chief Records Officer at the National Archives, I have a staff of about 100 people that work in the Washington, D.C. area and around the country, servicing about 250 different federal agencies, depending upon how you count them, providing them records and information management support. We support agencies that range from the huge, like the Department of Defense, all the way down to the Marine Mammal Commission, of which there is one, and they have a very good records management program. But as you can see, with 250 plus agencies and about 100 staff members, there's not nearly enough capacity to help support those issues. So we need to think differently and more creatively about the challenges that we're trying to deal with. And part of what we were able to do with the administration's Open Government Initiative, some work that we were able to do, in part pushed by CRU and National Security Archive and other organizations that have an interest in better records management, was to hold agencies more accountable and look at how they're managing their records and what they need to do to manage them more effectively. So with the Open Government Initiative, we had an administration who is very focused on this issue and very supportive of making it happen. With pressure from public interest groups and from GAO and other oversight organizations, we were able to restart our oversight program at the National Archives and start to do annual assessments of how well agencies are managing their records or how poorly agencies are managing their records, and do annual surveys on that and report out to the public on how that piece is working. And then kind of bringing those two things together, the open government piece, the increased oversight we're able to do, bring those two together to start thinking differently about how to drive change across the government in records and information management. And with that, we were able to approach the administration about how records management is the backbone of open government. Without effective records management, without good records management, you can't do FOIA. You can't carry out the mission of your agency. You can't protect the interests that your agency has. And at the end of the day, you also can't document the national experience and be able to deal with the patrimony issues that we talked about earlier in the presentations this afternoon. So we were able to bring all of those things together and make the case to the administration that we need to have high-level administration support for records management. So back in November of 2011, President Obama issued a presidential memorandum on managing government records. It was the first time that a president had opined on federal records management since the Truman administration, which is rather breathtaking. They're very excited about their presidential libraries, where they're located, how to make those records accessible, but the records of the Marine Mammal Commission and arcane parts of the Department of Defense, not so much. So we were able to work with the administration, have a presidential memorandum, the first of its kind since the 1950s, that kind of made the case that we have to change the way we think about managing records and making them available to the public. It is no longer acceptable to think about managing records in analog kinds of ways for traditional handoffs and individual people looking at individual documents and making decisions about them. We need to bring more technology and innovation, analytics, and those sorts of things to the challenge. So when the President issued the memorandum in 2011, he gave us a period of time to develop a directive that was talked about earlier today, where we set out a series of deadlines and requirements for agencies, for the National Archives, for OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and for the Office of Personnel Management to help kind of transform how records and information management is done across the government and kind of think, again, differently about how these things are done. I can talk about this for 2 hours, 5 minutes, or 7 days. So you're going to get the shorter version, and Judy's going to tell me to stop when I get close to the time, which is closer to 10 minutes than 7 days. The two main drivers within the directive are to transform the entire record-keeping function from an analog, paper-based approach to a digital, automated kind of approach to managing records. And to that end, there are two high-level deadlines within the directive. One is by the end of the decade. All agencies must manage their permanently valuable electronic records in automated ways, and ostensibly all of their electronic records need to be managed in automated ways by the end of the decade. And then by the end of 2016, all email, both temporary and permanent email, must be managed in electronic and automated ways as well. This is a huge sea change for the federal government, where most agencies, even today, as they're trying to transition to this period or to these deadlines and this kind of new way of working, still rely on policies of print and file, as in look at the email, print it, and file it in a paper record-keeping system. Even some of the electronic systems that somewhat automate this process are no more sophisticated than clicking on the email, dragging it into a file folder, which is then maintained electronically, which is no better than the paper approach. So what we have done is drawn a line in the sand where the agencies need to manage their email in automated ways by the end of 2016, and all permanently valuable records need to be managed in automated ways by the end of the decade. So it's all well and good to draw lines in the sand and tell people to do things and expect them to happen. The other thing that the directive also calls on and has established some framework for is ensuring compliance with federal record-keeping laws and regulations, and ensuring greater buy-in from senior-level officials within agencies to support this sort of activity. This has been done in a couple of ways. One, each agency has to have a senior agency official for records management now, and that person is responsible for making sure that the strategy for records and information management is consistent with its mission, with the laws and regulations of the Federal Records Act and the regulations that we promulgate under the Federal Records Act, and that there are resources made available within agencies to effectively manage their records consistent with statutes, laws, and things like the presidential directive. The other thing that we are also doing, aside from the senior agency official, is ensuring that agency records officers and others in agencies that have records management responsibilities, which in a number of agencies is virtually everyone, that there's greater accountability and knowledge about what those responsibilities are. Ensuring that records officers have completed the National Archives Records Management Certification Training Program so that they are as well trained as they need to be or as up to speed on the different issues that are confronting the federal government in the records and information management realm, so that they're able to do what they need to do to meet the business needs of their agency, protect the rights and interests of the government and citizens, and be able to get to the National Archives of permanently valuable records. So there's a major focus on training, awareness, accountability, and those sorts of issues. One of the things that we have done with this directive is held the senior agency officials accountable by reporting to us on an annual basis, not just on how the operational aspects of the records management program work, which we do now with the records management self-assessment, but to also report to us on an annual basis on how they're progressing towards these two deadlines. What kinds of challenges are they having in being able to automate all of the record-keeping systems? What kinds of challenges are they having in being able to provide access to these materials, those sorts of things? So right now we've gotten our first set of senior agency official reports that came in at the end of January, and our staff is back in College Park sitting in a glass-enclosed room, and I'm not kidding, it is a glass-enclosed room, just poring over all this material and trying to figure out what we're learning from the agencies that can be shared with others as best practices to kind of advance the agenda here, and then also to think about how we can hold them accountable for those agencies that are not making the progress that we expect them to make. Related to this oversight piece, there's increasing attention being paid to this activity, not just from the public interest groups and others, but the General Accounting Office is very focused on progress that's being made by agencies, and then they're opening an audit of the National Archives as well as all the cabinet-level agencies to see if they're actually paying attention to the directive and actually delivering on the change that is required within the directive. So that's kind of what the main goals of the directive are, where we're going with this activity, and what's going on in that piece. I want to give you a little bit of an outline of the different activities that we have going on related to getting to the end of the decade and having agencies manage all their electronic records, or at least all their permanently valuable electronic records electronically. And I should also say that a lot of what's driving the agenda for us is related to answering needs that agencies have on how to manage their records more effectively, but then also answering to some of the issues within the National Archives about how to get records in better condition before they come to us so that we can make them accessible immediately upon arrival, or at least know when we can make them accessible for different clearance kinds of reasons, and Bill can talk more about that as part of his presentation. When I give this talk, I sometimes think this is the Star Wars slide, and sometimes I think it's a tombstone. I'm in a Star Wars kind of mood today, so I think we're going to be okay. Just to give you, then actually for 2013 and 2014, there's a whole bulleted list of different things that we've been involved in related to the capstone guidance, where we've essentially told agencies that they need to think differently about how to manage their email records, not think about them in a series-by-series basis and think that you can segregate specific emails at a senior level officials, but draw a line across an agency and above a certain level, all of those emails will be deemed permanent, need to be preserved, capture everything else, and use automated technology to figure out how to make the disposition happen for those other materials. And that's the more creative ways of thinking about these issues that are different than the traditional archival approach to a lot of the matters that we're trying to confront. And I think the way we're dealing with email is kind of the tip of how we're going to be dealing with issues related to a lot of other different electronic records formats that are going to be they're not going to be challenges, but are challenges actually today. That kind of thinking is going to be incumbent upon us to carry out going forward. So there's a whole host of things that we've already done or in the process of doing. Capstone is one of them. Another is transfer guidance for permanently valuable electronic records. We have a framework now that identifies different technical standards by which we will take electronic records into the National Archives right now. Those standards are characterized in different kinds of ways depending upon how good the technology or the format is, and whether we should take the records immediately, or an agency needs to think about how to migrate those records over time to make sure that they're ready for us to take at the appropriate transition point. We're in the process of developing minimal metadata standards for agencies to follow, so that they know what they need to create and maintain before the records are transferred to us. We're also in the process where we're interacting with private industry and others, and we'd be interested in working with individuals like yourselves on some of the longer-term solutions to these issues. As was alluded to earlier, there's a lot more analytical work that can be done with records now to carry out a lot of the manual, process-intensive kinds of things that have been done in the past. And we've had industry days where we've had private sector groups come in and explain to us the different kinds of technologies that they have that are able to do the sorts of things we need to have done to manage these records more effectively. We've actually been up to Fort Meade and across the river to some other places to see different things that they're doing that have application in the records and information management realm that we think can benefit us, and trying to figure out how to bring all those things together to make this transition happen for all of us. So 2015, we're working on changing and improving the process by which disposition to agencies is provided, so that we can give disposition answers to agencies more quickly and more thoroughly, so that we can meet their business needs while protecting the interests of the National Archives and the American people. In 2016, that's the deadline for the piece related to the email. We're also using this as an opportunity to get more information from agencies on the records that they have scheduled or have not scheduled, and when they need to be transferred. 2017 is the general records schedule. This is a piece of arcana that is very important to records officers. This is how to deal with administrative records of low value that we need to help them get rid of so that they don't land up into the archives. These are the truly kind of transitory travel kinds of records that don't have a lot of historical value. And then we're not taking a rest in 2018, but we're keeping on through 2018 and 2019 to make this transition to a digital government and electronic records management take place. I'm going to leave you here with a slide that kind of gives you a sense of where you can go to hear more about what's going on at the archives in this area. We have a Records Express blog where we put up content pretty regularly about different pieces of guidance that we develop, different forums that we're having, all those sorts of things. We have a general email box that you can send questions about the directive to that we respond to. And, of course, you can reach out to me via email to learn more about different aspects of what I've talked about. And I've gotten the time is up slide, so I'm going to walk away. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Nice to see some friendly faces in the crowd. And for those of you who remember me from my librarian days, I didn't go off to an undisclosed location when I went to National Archives. I've been in College Park all along. I'm going to attempt to see if I can bring up a slide that would, well, we don't want to see me disappear in a shower of sparks here. There, that's it. Okay. So I want to thank Tom and Matt particularly, because being able to name the challenge is one of the most important aspects of the work facing us today. And it was sufficient for me to scrap every little bit of everything I thought about to talk to you, and am going in a completely new way right now. Because it's important, I have 10 minutes to share with you the most important aspect of what we're up against. The electronic stuff is actually easy, because computers do what we tell them to. They're not the smartest thing on this planet, but we can work with them. We really need to focus on our people, and that's the challenge. So if you think about, in the library world, what happened when cataloging saw the rise of the shelf-ready book coming from publishers, where you suddenly had books that were arriving off the trucks, fully labeled, barcoded, stamped, and just needed to have a simple bloop of the barcode scanner to change their status from in transit to on the shelf. cutting out that entire workload of the catalogers who would, measure and describe and do all these things, right? You remember this? Anybody, right? Okay. So we have the same challenge now, but the scale and scope and size is dramatic. 2 weeks ago, I was at Brown University, where they were launching their symposium on the research they had conducted on the Brazil coup in '64. So Brazil, 1964, from dictatorship to democracy. And it was fabulous because it's a success story. Here's a university led by a particularly energetic faculty member who had an idea and actually has gone to a number of places that deal with classified records, including the NSA, and created something out of these records that was new and changed people's lives. So when I was there talking about the challenge, part of the work was to help them understand, right now today we estimate that we have 12 billion pages of records, paper records, in the National Archives. 12 billion. And that's the 2% that we get. That's not counting everything that's sadly been tossed away, right? And there's people who have to deal with those boxes and have to deal with those records and have to deal with even thinking about how we digitize them. So it kind of boggles the mind, right? So as you come in to address these challenges and make progress on backlogs, and I'm not going to show you graphs of output and production. If you remember Meisner and his more product, less process article he was doing, I think that was the right way, because sometimes I forget and it's more process and less product, but that's not right. But his metric for processing archival holdings, well, we're already processing 5 times faster than that, and our backlogs are still dramatic. So the slide up on the screen shows the archival locations across the country that are under my direct management. We are, at NARA as an agency, we are 3,300 employees strong across the agency. 700 approximately of those employees work in research services. They are the custodians of the records, and they are the people who work with me. My job is to help give them an opportunity for being successful. Their work is making that connection between the record to the public who want it. Most recently, it's all in the traditional research rooms that happens, but we're partnering with our innovation group to do more web delivery, more digitization, basically more of everything. Currently, our focus is on digitizing the analog records. As Tom had mentioned, we do have 138 terabytes of materials in the Electronic Records Archives. It's a little difficult to extract anything out of that archive at the moment. And the Electronic Records Archive is a very good example of how money isn't just the answer, because if money was just the answer, Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin would have gotten it right. So there's a whole nother issue that we have to encounter out there that we're grappling with. So the map up here represents where people physically can come to the archives and deal with records. The cultural change that's happening since the transformation of the archives was underway a few years ago, thanks to the stewardship of David Ferriero, that Paul was talking about a little bit, is having people work differently than they ever had before. We have archival locations in California who, previously to thinking about things, if they received records for other people's records, other areas' records, they would just send it back to the customer and say, go talk to New York yourself. They wouldn't pick up the phone and call New York and say, hey, I've got somebody who wants to work with your records, what do we do? Well, we're changing that at a fundamental level, building a national framework for research and research services that will improve dramatically the customer experience. If you've read the AHA Perspectives article about concerns about the National Archives as well, declassification and access to those records impacts the work we're able to do. So, how am I doing on time? I'm trying to make, good. So, the other challenge I think I can describe for you is something for the people who are listening from home might not be the same, so I'll try to describe it. So 2 years in the agency. Here I come. fresh from academia, university librarianship, the cutting edge of innovation in making things happen and supporting our students and enabling success, right? And it's all good. Walk in the National Archives, and I see someone by a window like this. And for the people playing from home, I'm holding up the phone, gesturing like I'm holding up my phone by the window. Okay. And as I walk down the hallway at Archives 2, if anyone's been out there, it's a beautiful glass structure. I kept encountering people who were standing by the windows, and in some cases looked like they were either davening or doing something with their phone by the window. I got to my office and I logged in my computer and I realized, oh, I actually needed to go to that meeting, so I took my laptop and I was going to go down and do some work and crank out emails, but I discovered there was no network. There was no access. There's nothing. Nobody had a network. And I realized, uh-oh, we have some fundamental cultural change that we've got to affect. Well, 2 years later, we've got ubiquitous wireless happening throughout the building for the staff. We've took care of that problem for the public because they were also demanding it. And we're changing the way that staff interact and access the web and interact and access their records. Because at some point, we're going to need to have the humans still be involved in dealing with the records. After all, learning is a human-to-human moment. You know, for those of you who are dealing with online education courses and online delivery and asynchronous learning and sometimes synchronous learning, you know that the richest experience comes from the marrying the moment of the online resource and the in-person experience into something that leads us to new creations. So that's one facet of the challenge that research services has. We are at the end of the pipeline that the records management folks under Paul's stewardship create. So in many ways, we hear the clarion call. We need the records. Bring them in, bring them in, bring them in. But this map shows you physical locations. Where are we going to put the stuff? Now, I know librarians and libraries have solved the storage issue, right? You guys, right? Didn't you? I mean, I've been out of the game for a couple of years, but you guys solved it, right? You're like, yeah, it's all good. Okay. Amazingly enough, the storage issue still looms large for us in analog. And we have 30 years, at least, I'd say. Isn't 30 years a good estimate? We have 30 years of paper records still swirling about in the record centers that are going to come. Not even thinking about the analog or the electronic. I mean, it gives you pause for a moment. Indiana Jones was right. That, you know, Spielberg got it right. That whole warehouse of the boxes and how do you find it? But the work is dramatically important. And this is the thing that I would really want to stress to you, and I seek your partnership. I seek some solutions here. I don't have an electronic solution yet. We were hopeful to bring our CIO with us for this talk, but he couldn't make it. I'm seeking the human solution. I'm seeking ways that we can help lead people to see value and to think about risk differently. You know, how do you address significance? And for those of you who work with your preservation officers, you know that this is something that much time of debate can go into. How to save the record, how to save the book. If you walk into the National Archives, into the Rotunda, and go up to the Declaration of Independence, it's an incredibly overwhelming moment. There it is, democracy. But if you can't read it one day because it's faded beyond belief, does that mean that democracy has ceased? No. Just because the object is illegible doesn't mean the philosophy has to be gone. And that's the challenge that we're dealing with in changing our priorities and thinking about the ways that we have to deal with these records and thinking about the ways that we make choices. We can't possibly do it all. We know we can't do it all ourselves. So let me echo back to this Brown Symposium. And it's interesting that Bernie started off talking about Brazil, and Tom and I were talking about Brazil, and I know that Brazil for your admissions officers is really a hot topic, right? Brazil is really hot right now. And it's important. And it was great to have a faculty member come to me and come up with an idea, and we were able to bring in their research team and support them at the National Archives and see it turn into something incredibly meaningful. I met a priest who had been jailed and tortured in Brazil 2 weeks ago as part of the symposium. And it struck me with the whole reason I do what I do at the National Archives. You could ask me what's my favorite record, and I couldn't tell you. I mean, remember the 12 billion, not counting the electronic stuff? The records that are my favorite are the ones that change people's lives. And that's what we've got to set free together. And that's the challenge we've got, because my 700 people across the country, there is absolutely no way we're able to do it on our own. So the pockets of excellence and the solutions that your universities that you're making progress on, that's what we've got to tap into. And I'll leave you with that.
Okay. Here. Can everybody hear me? Okay. All right. So, thanks very much. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Bill. That was terrific. Really enjoyed it. But I'd like to say thanks very much to CRL for inviting myself and Paul to come here today. We're really very honored to be here and super pleased. Always interested in talking to people about what we do and learning about what other people are doing. So, I'm going to do the part of our presentation where I'm going to paint you a picture of the Canadian context. There are some distinctions, as you know, and that's really important for me to give to you, because Paul's going to do all the heavy lifting, and it will have a lot more meaning if you kind of understand the Canadian context that I'm going to give you now. Okay, so historically, the vast size of our country and the relatively low population created a natural market for robust and constantly evolving telecommunications networks in Canada. Our economy and our unique geography have created the ideal conditions for an extremely digital country. Some facts to note. Canadians are amongst the highest internet and mobile device users in the world, spending more than 41 hours per month online on their desktop computers and representing the second highest engagement across the globe in this respect. Canada's ability to use digital technology and networking tools ranks above the average compared to other OECD countries. And to push this connectivity, our government is planning now, very recently, to actually ensure that over 98% of Canadians will have access to high-speed internet, even in the most remote parts of the country, by 2017. This is a big commitment that's just been made recently. From a business perspective, according to Statistics Canada, in 2000, that's our federal agency for our national statistics, in 2012, 80% of enterprises with 10 or more employees had a web presence, and internet usage was almost universal at 98%. More than half of Canadian enterprises used internet-enabled mobile devices such as smartphones, phones, or tablets in 2012. Clearly, technology has and continues to significantly change the way Canadians interact with government and with business. Canadians show a high level of digital readiness and a huge appetite for more digital content, more digital functionality, and faster and greater access via mobile self-serve devices. Put simply, it's a very digital nation, and it's becoming even more digital every day. So all the behaviors, the interests, the expectations that come through that come home to us in the kind of business that we're all in. So now I'm going to turn to the Government of Canada more specifically. For its part, the Canadian government is laying the groundwork for this digital environment through the way it regulates industry and telecommunications, and in how it provides innovation opportunities to Canadian businesses. By the same token, government itself and the way it works has risen to the challenge in conducting its own business. This role can be seen in our government's commitment to going digital, its lead role that we're playing in the international open government agenda, and the establishment of a strong regime of transparency and accountability. The Government of Canada recently launched, I think it was just within the last 2 weeks, the Digital Canada 150, which is the plan to guide Canada's digital future, and it underscores 5 key public policy pillars. 1, connecting Canadians. 2, protecting Canadians. 3, the opportunities of a digital economy. 4, digital government. And 5, digital Canadian content. And Library and Archives Canada, of course, we cut across some of this, but we're really big players on the Canadian content, of course. This plan commits also that the Government of Canada will demonstrate leadership in the use of digital technologies and open data. And again, we're big players in the open data world in Canada. Another significant public policy position is our digital information landscape is Canada's Action Plan on Open Government, which is part of the federal government's efforts to foster greater openness and accountability. We're responsible at Library and Archives Canada for at least 3 of the initiatives in that 14-point plan, one of which is proactive disclosure, or we call it block review of many of the federal records that are under our care and custody. Canadians are very accustomed to interacting with and receiving services from the federal government through digital technologies. The most mature example, it's an obvious one, but it's extremely mature, is the ability to interact, to receive services and file tax returns online with the Canada Revenue Agency. We also have an incredibly successful initiative called Service Canada, which has been in play for about 7 years now, I suppose, and that provides all the cradle-to-grave services that Canadians need, going right from birth to death, as I said, and unemployment in between, and all of those things. So that is a single window, a guichet unique, a single window for Canadians to come in and get those services or speak to a person, and they link to provincial and territorial services of the same type. So it's a well-functioning system. Internally, the Canadian government is consolidating many of its internal digital services to gain efficiencies and consistencies. And yes, there are economies of scale, and that's one of the big drivers here, but what this also does is it ensures greater information exchange and repurposing across departments. That makes it easier for people to get information. This move has seen the creation of a new government institution, which is called Shared Services Canada, and this, for instance, is establishing one common email service for the entire Government of Canada and centralized and standardized IT services to government departments. In addition, we're consolidating our web presence in the Government of Canada, and we are now radically reducing the number of individual websites in the gc.ca domain. This can only be accomplished by standardizing content, approaches, archiving, and enhancing the search capacity that will help citizens find the information that they're looking for. And this is having this is being well received by Canadians. They no longer have to go fishing for information across every darn website in the government. There's one place, it's thematic in the language that people use when they think about services or information. In terms of electronic record keeping in the Government of Canada, central federal agencies are leading the development of a common enterprise management system known as GC-Docs, which is currently in the process of being rolled out in selected government departments. From a published perspective, the Government of Canada is moving to an all-digital publishing model where we are no longer doing print depository services, only a central digital repository for government publications. So overall, the Canadian government is positioning its services to promote a strong digital Canadian economy and to serve citizens in a transparent, efficient, and agile manner. Within this context, Library and Archives Canada is taking a deliberate and strategic approach. It's not perfect, but it's practical, and it is starting to show good results and a lot of promise for the future. So we're delivering on our mandate using this. We're working very much upstream. In the last 10 years, we saw the same core shifts that you've all seen and that Paul and Bill touched on, which is forcing us to make the transition to digital, of course. We've gone from paper to a multitude of formats and metadata, an extremely mixed and heterogeneous environment. We've all gone from one-to-one service models to one-to-many service models and to collaborative models, from manageable to overabundant information. At LAC, at the beginning in 2008, we stepped back and looked at our traditional analog approach to record keeping, and it hit us pretty hard. This is not only workable for the long haul, but it wasn't sustainable, and it would never be affordable. So the solution isn't money. It was looking at things very, very differently. We've strategically connected our digital approach to transparency, open government, and democratic integrity while not deviating from our core legislative mandate. So our core legislative mandate is to acquire, preserve, and make accessible Canada's documentary heritage, and this includes all federal government records for the memory of government, archives, and publications both. Our textual government holdings, both digital and analog, account for about 78% of our total archival collection. We also have a key role in advising on the management of the government's information resources, which are growing at an alarming rate in the digital context. It's estimated right now that email alone accounts for over 14 petabytes of unmanaged information stored in GC email systems, Government of Canada information systems, and archives, 1 petabyte being equal to 2 million file cabinets or 1 trillion pages. So it's not the same scale as you folks here or Tunara, but for us this is pretty big. Once emails and other records with enduring value, and enduring value is what we get, move to LAC Holdings, they are used and accessed for traditional research requests and increasingly for research directly connected to the rights and privileges of citizens, whether via individual access to information requests or through massive research projects such as Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is researching the experience of Aboriginal students that were in our Indian residential schools. This is a massive undertaking that we're doing right now. While the scope and the size of our collections, as I mentioned, is not on the same scale as our good friends and colleagues to the south, the task before us is nonetheless daunting. Fortunately, we have a number of levers which are helping us to succeed with respect to our role. The first involves our partnership with Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada, which is essentially the board of management of government in the federal system in our country. And this institution is responsible for leading the development of the policy for the Government of Canada regarding information management, which is a pretty important relationship for us to have. And I co-chair several government-wide information management committees with the Treasury Board Secretariat. So we have a shared responsibility for information management in the Government of Canada, and that means we have to build strong partnerships. The same theme that Bill and Paul were talking about. It's all about partnerships and working collaboratively now. It's even more crucial in a digital environment because we need to leverage our collective strengths to actually address common challenges. The positioning of information as a corporate asset and the assessment of record-keeping effectiveness in the performance evaluation of senior officials is another asset that we have. There's high interest and support amongst our most senior government officials for the work that they do to improve record-keeping practices. Case in point, our government maintains a management accountability framework, which is a public scorecard that government institutions are rated on annually. It requires deputy heads of government institutions to report on 15 areas of management every year. One of these is information management. So they're publicly measured. The key element of the government's information management policy framework that we have developed jointly with Treasury Board is the government-wide information management policy, under which lies for us the directive on record keeping. In 2009-10, this was launched. By 2015, the commitment is that all of the records will come in digitally, and so it's very much premised on going digital while recognizing we still have a lot of analog material, and we always will, to deal with. We've reinforced the notion of value in this directive, and it's one of the key concepts in the directive. It requires departments manage their information strategically by identifying what has business value for them. Generally speaking, information of business value represents a smaller portion of all the information generated on a daily basis by a modern bureaucracy. There's a lot of ephemeral and a lot of junk in the system. By concentrating on managing information of business value, departments save money, economies of scale, but they also support LAC's mandate. We subsequently concentrate our resources at looking at what they have a business value, and we determine what has enduring value and comes to us. And that essentially, we need to make sure we have all the records that are key decision-making and key operations. So we have a significant role as enabler, convener, and facilitator in this with all the government institutions. One of the ways in which we do this is by growing the people capacity. So we foster the community of practice around information management and record keeping in the government. We hold record keeping days, which are hugely successful. We need to leverage that human capacity, which Bill was talking about, across the public service. So we have to have that one-to-many, and we have to equip people with the tools that they can use to have that capacity, to grow that capacity then in their departments. Additionally, we developed a suite of record-keeping tools known as generic evaluation tools. These provide recommendations to departments on the types of information resources of business value which may be created by common activities performed by multiple government institutions. They also provide a starting point for retention specifications. Overarching multi-institutional tools as these take us from a one-to-one to a one-to-many impact, and it extends our reach. Final concept that underlies our information management policy framework in the Government of Canada that I'd like to point out is a shift in our thinking about the separation between records and publications. As this session highlights, in our personal and professional lives, we increasingly rely on information from a huge variety of sources. We are less and less concerned about what format that information is in. We're more interested in what is the content and what is the value of that content. This has caused the lines that traditionally separated libraries and archives to shift. The Government of Canada's approach to information supports this shift by moving away from a separation between records and publications to the more holistic concept of information resources. So we believe this reflects how information is created, managed, and being used today. So a few observations that I want to make, and I'm going to wrap it up because I know I'm over time and I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. So it's not perfect. I've talked about some of the good things that we're doing, but we have to push forward on this, and we are seeing some good results. But a few observations about what's working and what I worry about. One is we have really strong political support, and we have really strong engagement from senior managers. This is huge. Without that public policy direction and without this kind of essential leadership, we will not succeed at all. We will not get any traction on this. So I worry, how long will we have that for? That's crucial. Number two, risk-based approaches. We now know that if information is to be treated as an asset, we need to apply risk-based approaches to manage the sheer quantities of information that's produced at a speed that accelerates daily. So our IM practices have to be based on a clear understanding of business value, and we need to have a lot of rigor around that. And we have senior information management officials responsible in every department for ensuring that rigor is there. So risk-based approaches, we have to use those. It's strategic. Three, one of the key concepts also about our record-keeping directive, there has to be readiness in a department for us to issue a disposition authority to them. So IM readiness, the way that is assessed, it's very uneven. This is particularly difficult for smaller departments where they lack capacity, but it's true across the board. Some are really in good shape, some are not. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all. So the unevenness is a big, big challenge. So getting to consistent matters. Tools, standardization, these are important. 4, the consolidated standardized tools. I got there without much work. 5, keeping our legislated mandate our foremost priority. It's very easy to get distracted and to waste time on bright, shiny things, to get caught up in the technology. Our test for everything we do is, I look at the act all the time and say, are we doing our core business? Are we acquiring, preserving, and making accessible? My last point. If we can agree that no memory institution is overfunded today, it's not going to get better. So if we're looking for solutions that involve getting more money, we will all be frustrated and none of us will achieve results. We need to look at the work differently. This is what's making the difference. We need to look at working through others. We need to decide on, is there a way of dividing up the work? So how do we put in place good collaborations? How do we have coherence about how we work together? So in all of this, this brings me to my very last point, and I really am going to stop. Our institution is judged by our political masters and by our citizens in terms of how usable are we. Which goes back to what Tom and Matthew were talking about earlier. How accessible are we? Do people know about us? Are they using us? Are we accessible? That's the public measure. So we're completely irrelevant if we're not accessible. So everything we do has to be a strategy which is not an investment just in record keeping. It has to be an investment in record keeping, records that are accessible. So we need strategies that cut across our acquisition, our preservation, and our access goals. We need to do all three at once. We can't have separate strategies. They have to be horizontal. And now I'm going to turn it over to Paul. Thank you.
So I think I'm the shiny technology guy she was talking about, and that's probably a statement about my head, but as much as I'd like to talk about my 1 year at the Flying Club, as director of the Flying Club, I'll keep it focused on what we're talking about today. It is an honor to be here, and I'm glad that you weren't able to bring a CIO, because I think I can probably stand the first CIO to speak to CRL. I'm not sure if that's a true statement or not, but I'll use it for now. And I think one thing that Cecilia mentioned around the value and the why we're doing all of this is it has to be based in the access. When I joined Library and Archives about 8 months ago, I've been at the Department of Justice for 2 years as CIO. Lawyers are great information managers. They're not the most people that like to share the information amongst themselves. We had about 5,000 employees, about 3,000 lawyers. Each one was an excellent information manager in and of themselves. But to try to share that information, a similar case or a similar opinion that was rendered, that wasn't going to happen. And so there's actually even a program that was developed there called Speaking with One Voice. And the idea that if there was an opinion given to one department, well, that opinion should be shared with all of the other lawyers, the other 2,500, 3,000 lawyers, so that if the same opinion needed to be rendered, the law firm called the Department of Justice Canada would render the same opinion. So it was a very, very staunch reality in terms of understanding how information was shared or wasn't shared just within one department. And then you multiply that out to 160 departments, and obviously the problem gets exponential. So it comes down to access. And so I'll take the macro access model that we're talking about here from a library and archives perspective, that we've got clients on the right-hand side of that screen. So the Canadians, I should have put an American flag up there as well. But really, it's global clients that we have. And we don't know where our clients are going to be coming from. They could be scholars in England. They could be scholars here, university researchers in the United States. They could be Canadian citizens. And right now we've got a tri-modal service delivery model. So call, click, consult. And our colleagues to Cecilia, Paul really mentioned around, what it looked like. And I think it was Bill had the map up there, the regional centers. Well, we've got one main center where you can access the collection, and that's in Ottawa. And that's not very convenient if you're sitting here in Chicago or if you're in Vancouver. And so if you're trying to access a physical document, we don't send it across the country. So the internet obviously breaks down those barriers if that item is actually digitized and actually available in a digital fashion. There's always going to be a reason to go and see the physical assets depending on the kind of research you're doing, and so that still remains a service channel that we'll always see. But as apart from being the primary service channel, we start to move away from that, but we have to have the infrastructure built to actually allow for that kind of access to happen. So the idea being that value gets created throughout the organization. At the bottom you'll see we talk about facilitating acquisitions, enabling preservation, and offering access. Again, when I got to the Library and Archives, I thought, well, I'm joining a preservation organization. We preserve the records of the documentary heritage of Canada. And if we transport you all to Gatineau, Quebec, where our head office is right now, there's a fantastic preservation center there that houses all of the documentary heritage of Canada. It has temperature-controlled, humidity-controlled vaults, some that are managed to be able to handle microfilm, to be able to handle nitrate film. It's fantastic. We are what I would call a trusted analog repository. And that's fantastic. But if all of the information is sitting in there and it's not accessible, or at least at the very, very least discoverable by our clients, then we've failed from a mandate perspective. And that's something that's really turning the organization's business model on its head. And I think it's going to drive a very, very different investment structure. It's going to drive a very different business model within not only Library and Archives, but also with our partner departments. And we'll talk about how we're actually working with them moving forward. So we think from a federal department perspective, there's 160 major federal organizations. I think there's 280 if you consider some of the marine mammal type organizations. We provide, as Library and Archives, a whole host of services to those organizations. So not only do we take in their records of enduring value, I think you call them records of preservation. There's a call permanent records. Permanent records. National experience. So lots of all those terms. Well, we call them records of enduring value. And so and in the organizations that we're serving, the other departments, they are called records of business value. And at some point, a record of business value either gets disposed of or gets deemed as being something that's enduring value and gets sent over to the Library and Archives Canada. So today that happens primarily in an analog fashion. We're working we've actually done a number of tests from a digital ingest perspective to be able to take this information digitally from departments. And I'll talk about how we're going to actually be able to accelerate that with some of the concepts that Cecilia mentioned earlier. But we have these 5 main functions that we provide to other government departments, one of them being legal deposits. So any publication that a government department puts out, we get copies of that. That's part of our legal deposit function. That happens for all Canadian publications, and the government falls into that space as well. Records management, this is the big piece. Around the disposition authority, the Library and Archivist of Canada is the sole individual to be able to put out or to authorize departments to dispose of their records. But that instrument then gets passed on to each of the departments and needs to be negotiated. So again, as Paul was saying, if you have national defense, for us it's one of our largest departments as well, the kind of disposition authorities that are required there are very, very different than what you would require even at Department of Justice, which is a much smaller organization. So that work needs to get done, that upfront work needs to get done so that whether we're talking digital or analog, we understand the scope of what is in context for what our clients are going to be able to achieve, get access to from Library and Archives Canada. Record-keeping advice, as Cecilia mentioned, we've got a whole bunch of tools and ways that we actually engage with our departments in terms of helping them understand their accountabilities and obviously the relationship between the organizations. An important piece, obviously one that's coming up, is web archiving. We've done a number of archives of our government domain, and as we move forward with that single window, that Canada.ca, although technically it gets a little bit easier to harvest that information because it's one single website as opposed to 160 plus. The frequency at which we want to start archiving that gets a lot quicker because you want to be able to have that sort of time machine model where somebody can go back and say, well, what did the internet presence look like on April 24th, 2014? And then they want to, you should be able to go back and see what that looked like, whether it's for litigation purposes or research purposes. The ability to do that is there. Now it's a question of how do we put that in the hands of users and so that it contextualizes it for them in a way that makes sense. And the last piece, I think, is the one that Cecilia left off on in terms of risk management of documentary heritage. When I got there, I said, well, we have to digitize everything. Well, they kind of looked at me and said, well, that's not going to happen. So how do you take a risk-based approach to ensure that we're digitizing the right stuff? That model changes a little bit when you're dealing with born digital information because the filters you have to apply and the amount of effort that you have to apply to bring the information in is much less. As long as you have the right contextual engines, if you will, and I'm not talking about the technology, but the contextual piece on the end is really critical. The digitization is really on a risk-based approach. This is my last slide, and I'll spend a little bit of time here. There's a number of key points around this. So we're really moving towards a digital curation model, and the goal is for LAC to become a trusted digital repository. This is a generic model that was put out. There's a whole bunch of different models. But the key point around the outcome of the Library and Archives becoming a trusted digital repository is very different than if you go back 7 years even, where people were implementing trusted digital repositories. It was very much a technology-based solution. It was buy the right kind of systems, ensure the right kind of redundancy, It's not simply that. It has everything to do with everybody in this room. It has everything to do with the archivists and the historians that work with us, their capacity, their ability to actually work in a digital world. What kind of competencies does an organization need to actually be a trusted digital repository? And I'll harken back to that building that I mentioned. We have a very, very rigorous set of processes and procedures and a physical location that allows us to really call ourselves a trusted analog repository. I can tell you with almost 100% certainty, and I'm sure Cecilia would say 100%, if you give us a document, that document will be there for generations to come. We need to have exactly the same kind of rigor around our digital assets. We don't have that today. And, if we try to build it, which has been the folly a little bit of organizations, you'll always be behind the 8 ball because organizations, especially federal organizations, don't get the kind of funding needed to actually be able to stay ahead of Moore's Law, right? Every second year, you double the computing capacity. Well, that means every 2 years, you're obsolete. And if we go back to Tom's presentation this morning, he was talking about a 25-year time span. Well, that's 12 times obsolescence over in that 25 years. So you have to leverage in private sector as much as possible. Now, I know it's a little bit different in the U.S. context. Within Library and Archives, we're looking at a bimodal approach of delivering services from a preservation perspective mostly, where there are some documents that are going to have to be housed within Government of Canada data centers. And so if you think of classified material, if you think of government records that haven't been from your federal information access information, the ATIP. Freedom of Information, thank you. I'll even try the acronym. But, that information needs to be housed within government centers. But there's an enormous amount of information that is public and doesn't have to be housed in centers. And if you think about things where you have streaming media and so forth, again, from a technology perspective, and I promise this is the only technical part of the presentation, there's no sense in having that riding on a Government of Canada network or a Government of Canada sitting in the Government of Canada data center. That's really expensive. And if we're successful, then the kind of access that we want to be able to offer is the kind of access you get on whether it's YouTube or Amazon, that kind of ubiquitous. You don't ever consider that YouTube is not going to have the kind of streaming media capacity that you need. So we're going to be working with private sector because those records can be held in the States. They can be held over in Asia. As long as the service levels are appropriate and they can actually deliver the service to our clients in the way that we need, and the way that researchers, all of you, expect to be able to get at that information. I think it behooves governments to look at different ways of delivering it. And the last piece I'll leave off with is really one where the content is very important, and I'm talking about how do we manage the specific elements of content. But going back to that user experience and that access model, the context is really king. And, we're seeing that more and more. And in Canada, we've got, we're talking about the digitization of important records. Our minister just recently announced, as part of our commemoration from the First World War, we're digitizing the 655,000 military records from the military personnel that served in the First World War. So that work is being done, it's being digitized, and we're going to be putting that online. Users, there's different kinds of clients, right? There's the very, very educated researchers sitting in this room that understand the kind of research that they need to do to get at the information. They know how to do the data mining. But there's a whole raft of clients out there that don't know how to do that, and they need to have some data contextualization, whether it's visual, whether it's textual. But that context is really where the value gets added. And we have partners that have actually digitized a lot of content for us. And the information is sitting on their website. It's our information sitting somewhere else. And what we're doing is we're going to create a user experience that allows them to get at that information in a seamless fashion. They shouldn't have to worry about, is it over at, and I'll give you some names, of Canadiana, is it at Ancestry, or is it at Library and Archives? Maybe it'll be at a Library of Congress, or maybe it'll be at NARA one day. And that should be irrelevant to our clients, because the contextualization of the data is really what they're after, not where the containers are actually stored. So we'll stop there and bring it over to questions. Thank you.